I never thought I'd be standing in the middle of my family's 150-year-old front yard, screaming at a woman in a blazer while my grandfather fought for his life in the back of an ambulance she had deliberately blocked with her SUV. I was pulse-pounding watching the paramedics argue with a woman named Karen Dodd, president of the Willow Glen Heritage HOA, as every second ticked toward tragedy. If you're someone who thinks HOA drama is just about grass length and mailbox color, let me tell you this story will change your mind forever. You're watching Sham Story, subscribe right now so you never miss a story where justice finds its way through the chaos. My name is Julian Carter, and our family's farmhouse stood at the corner of Willow Glen Road since 1872. Older than the HOA, older than the post office, older than the county itself, passed down from great-grandfather to grandfather to father to me, a monument to survival, heritage, and stubbornness. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, had lived there since birth, retired engineer, Korean War vet, and the sharpest man I'd ever known, even at 91. He believed in hard work, community, and respecting what you inherit. That house meant everything to him, and by extension, everything to me. But none of that mattered to Karen Dodd, who moved into Willow Glen 6 years ago and immediately began treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She hated our house from the moment she laid eyes on it, the chipped white paint, the wraparound porch with its creaky swing, the rust-red barn that stood crooked from time. Eyesore, she called it at every board meeting. Embarrassment. To the community. Never mind that it had been there before her, before any of them. Her HOA sent us letters, monthly paint this, replace that, remove the vintage weather vane from the roof because it was unapproved signage. My grandfather ignored most of them, choosing instead to quote property law, which only seemed to enrage her further. Things escalated when Karen convinced the board to rewrite the bylaws. They passed rules that made our style of home non-compliant rules, about porch dimensions, historical color schemes, even the type of fencing allowed. 1 month we were fined for the shape of our mailbox, the next for having a gravel driveway instead of concrete. When we pushed back, she retaliated by blocking our historical designation petition, citing community aesthetic concerns. Wanted us out. In the morning, my grandfather collapsed on the front steps, clutching his chest. Was the moment she made it personal. I called 911 the second I found him, slumped over in the garden, barely conscious. I rode with him in the ambulance, holding his hand, whispering that everything would be okay. We turned onto Willow Glen Road and made it 3 blocks before slamming to a stop. Karen's silver Range Rover was parked sideways across the road, hazard lights blinking. She stood in front of it, arms crossed, speaking into a walkie-talkie. The driver honked. She didn't move. A paramedic jumped out, rushing to her, demanding she cleared the road. She held up a clipboard and pointed to a laminated document. Emergency vehicles must use the east entrance per HOA emergency route. Protocols, she said. You're in violation. I burst from the back doors, furious. He's dying, I shouted. Get out of the way. She looked at me without flinching. Then maybe your family should have followed community standards. You've ignored every letter, every notice. Actions have consequences. The paramedic pushed past me and tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't budge. We're losing time, the EMT shouted to the driver. He backed up, turned the rig around, and drove the longer route nearly 10 more minutes to loop. Around the hill, my grandfather never regained consciousness. He passed before we reached the hospital. The ER doctor said he might have had a chance if we'd arrived just 3 minutes sooner. 3 minutes. I sat in that waiting room, drenched in sweat, grief twisting through me like a blade. And I thought of Karen's face, calm, smug, convinced she had the law on her side. I wasn't angry. I was volcanic. She hadn't just blocked a vehicle. She'd killed a man. My grandfather didn't live through a war, a recession, and 6 decades of community service just to be stopped by a clipboard-wielding tyrant who thought the street was hers. That night I went back to the house alone. Porch light flickered. As I stepped over the spot where he'd fallen, inside the air smelled like old coffee and cedar, the last meal still on the kitchen counter. I found his ledger on the desk where he kept all the HOA letters, carefully cataloged, annotated, and countered with legal references. I flipped through it and saw he'd been preparing a case to challenge the bylaws he had been building. Something, quietly, methodically. And I realized I would finish what he started. The next morning, I walked straight into the county registrar's office and filed for a restraining order against Karen Dodd on the grounds of obstruction and endangerment. The clerk raised an eyebrow, but when I showed her the footage from the ambulance dash cam and the Range Rover blocking the road, she went pale. "You'll want to speak with the sheriff," she said, and I did. The sheriff's office had received numerous complaints about Karen over the years, noise ordinance citations selectively enforced, mailbox slashing incidents she blamed on others, and a still-open investigation into forged board member signatures from a year prior. I handed over everything my grandfather had collected, then went to a lawyer, a very good one. I cashed out a mutual fund my grandfather had set up for me and told the attorney I wanted two things: justice and the HOA gone. He smiled. "We can do both?" The process began quietly. I requested all HOA meeting minutes and bylaws under the Sunshine Law, and what I found was astonishing. Karen had rewritten key voting rules to allow proxies without verification, enabling her to control the board by collecting fake votes. She had also altered quorum requirements and passed emergency measures in secret meetings. It wasn't just Shadia was illegal. With the help of a civil rights organization, we filed suit against the Willow Glen HOA for abuse of authority, obstruction of emergency services, and falsification of governance. News spread fast. Local media picked up. The ambulance story, then regional news, and suddenly Karen Dodd was being chased by reporters outside her yoga studio. "Do you regret blocking emergency access?" one asked. "No comment," she snapped, but the damage was done. The board panicked. 2 members resigned. A third tried to disavow her completely, but I wasn't finished. One petitioned the neighborhood to call an emergency vote under Article 17 of the original charter, clause that allowed homeowners to dissolve the HOA entirely if 70% voted in favor. Karen tried to stop it, claiming the clause was outdated. My lawyer proved her wrong. I knocked on every door, explained everything, showed them the footage, the lawsuit, the pattern of abuse. People who'd been afraid to speak out finally opened up. One couple said they'd been fined for planting daisies, another for having a flag on their porch. By the end of the week, I had 83%. We called the vote. The neighborhood showed up. Cameras were there. So was Karen. And what happened next would make headlines across the country. The community center buzzed with the kind of tension you feel right before a storm breaks. A silent but electric anticipation of something irreversible. And as I stood near the back wall of the room with the notarized petition in my hand, I could feel the shift happening in real time, the mood of the neighbors turning from passive compliance to something sharper, more focused, a quiet rage finally being given direction. The HOA emergency vote was underway. Despite Karen Dodd's desperate attempt to delay the meeting with procedural objections and rambling speeches about neighborhood tradition, the signatures were valid, the turnout was overwhelming, and her grip was slipping fast. People who hadn't spoken a word at HOA meetings in years now raised their voices. And not just about the ambulance incident, though, that had become the spark butt about years of fines, threats, surveillance, and intimidation masked as governance. A retired veteran named Malcolm from across the street stood up and said he'd lived in Willow Glen for 42 years and had never once had a violation until Karen took over. Then he got 11 in 6 months, including one for having an American flag on a pole too tall for code. The room clapped. A single mom named Belinda broke down in tears as she described how the HOA threatened her with a lien for leaving a kid's inflatable pool out overnight. And when she asked for a hearing, they scheduled it during her shift and ruled in her absence. People began to realize it wasn't just them, it was all of us. Karen, standing stiffly in a cream-colored pantsuit near the podium, tried to keep control. She banged a gavel and declared the meeting unofficial. But the county representative attending as an observer corrected her. "This is a legally binding petition process," he said. "You don't have veto power here." That's when she snapped. Her face flushed red, and she launched into a tirade about how the community was being manipulated, how outsiders were trying to dismantle everything she'd built, how the neighborhood would fall into chaos and decline without strict oversight. I walked to the front of the room and stood next to the board table, calmly placing the petition in front of the representative. "You don't own this community," I said, meeting her eyes. "You're just a neighbor. You stopped being a good one a long time ago." Silence. Then slowly, people began to applaud. The vote was counted in real time. Paper ballots dropped into a locked box, tallied by 2 independent volunteers and the county representative. When the final number was read 76% in favor of dissolving the HOA, there was no cheering, no outburst. It's just a collective exhale, the kind that comes when people realize they've finally been heard. Karen stormed out before the meeting adjourned, her phone pressed to her ear, muttering something about appealing to county zoning, but the process was legal, final, and well documented. Willow Glen's HOA was no more. That night I sat on the porch of our 150-year-old home, lit by the soft glow of antique lanterns and the hum of cicadas in the trees. I expected to feel victory, and I did, but underneath it was something deeper relief. My grandfather would have wanted this. It's not revenge, but restoration, respect, the right to live on your land without being bullied off it. But the story didn't end there. 2 days later, I received a letter in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a photo of Karen Dodd speaking with a man in a suit beside a black SUV parked behind a strip mall on the back. In neat handwriting were the words Mountain Crest Holdings. She was working with them. That name sparked something. I remembered it from the ledger my grandfather kept, a company that had submitted unsolicited offers to purchase our property more than once, always at suspiciously low prices. I dug into the name and found it was connected to a real estate acquisition firm known for targeting historic neighborhoods, using tactics like weaponized code enforcement to pressure families into selling, then flipping the homes into overpriced luxury remodels. The same firm had bought up 6 homes in Willow Glen over the past 3 years, each one following months of aggressive HOA fines. I took this information to our attorney, who confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't just about control. He said she was prepping the neighborhood for acquisition. You dissolved the HOA, you cut the leash. Word spread quickly. Local reporters began investigating. They uncovered records of Karen attending closed-door meetings with Mountain Crest executives and receiving consulting fees through a shell LLC she'd registered in her maiden name. It was corruption, plain and simple, using her position to drive out residents, artificially lower property values, and then profit off the flip. The sheriff's office reopened its dormant investigation, and within weeks, Karen was indicted on charges of fraud, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to commit real estate manipulation. She was arrested quietly at her home one Sunday morning, and as her mugshot made its way across news outlets, Willow Glen became the center of a growing conversation about HOA abuse across the state. But even as justice began its slow march through the court system, the community still had work to do. Without the HOA, we needed to rebuild trust not with rules and fines, but with real neighborly care. We held a meeting on the lawn of the old library and formed a volunteer committee not to govern, but to serve. We mowed lawns for elderly residents, repaired fences, shared tools, and helped each other clean up the backlog of nonsense citations that had built up. For the first time in years, the community felt like a community. I repainted the old barn with help from a few teenagers on summer break. Someone brought lemonade. We put up a new mailbox, the kind my grandfather had designed decades ago. Number 1 objected. No one fined me. People smiled when they walked past, and I could almost feel my grandfather on the porch, nodding in approval. But just as things started to settle, I received another message. This one wasn't a letter, but a USB drive slipped under my door in a plain manila envelope. On it was a single video file, grainy footage of a man standing in front of a planning board map, pointing to Willow Glen, saying this was a trial zone. If we can flip this block, we move to the Ridge and Elm Valley next. The camera panned to reveal Karen Dodd in the background, nodding. My stomach turned. This wasn't isolated. This was organized. And Willow Glen was just the beginning. I took the drive straight to the sheriff's office, where the lead investigator added it to the case file. He looked at me grimly and said, "This just became bigger than zoning violations." I realized then that dissolving the HOA wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a bigger fight. One that might go far beyond our street, our county, even our state. One where I'd have to decide if I was willing to take the next. Step 2, follow the trail, expose the network, and make sure this never happened to another family like mine again. The return of Mountain Crest Holdings under the disguise of eastlandrevive.org wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration that the machinery behind these neighborhood takeovers had adapted and spread like a virus, shifting from Willow Glen to new towns, new states, with new names, but the same cold ambition: acquire, flip profit, repeat, all while using fear and fabricated authority to grind homeowners down into desperation. As I stared at the website, stock photos of smiling families and freshly painted fences eerily familiar, I saw the exact same language Karen Dodd used in her HOA newsletters, phrases like restoring pride, bringing order, and unlocking property potential. I immediately contacted Special Agent Ramirez, who told me they had intelligence that Mountain Crest had been quietly buying influence in city councils along the East Coast through political donations and consulting fees. This thing goes deeper than we thought, she admitted. And if they've gone national, we need a new approach. That same day, Natalie and I went live with an emergency expose on the Home Guard website, detailing how Eastland Revive was a direct continuation of the Willow Glen operation. Within hours, our post was shared over 50,000 times. News outlets picked it up. Former HOA members from New Jersey and Pennsylvania contacted us with eerily similar stories: overnight rule changes, massive fines for trivial offenses, then mysterious letters offering to buy them out. One man from Albany told us he was fined $5,000 for non-compliant window trim and then offered $200,000 for a home worth nearly double. They told me I could leave clean or fight and lose everything, he said. We started connecting the dots. Eastland Revive had been incorporated in Delaware, same as Mountain Crest. The board members were different names but the same birth dates. And their lead attorney had previously represented 2 of the indicted executives from the original case. It was the same monster wearing a new mask. At a town hall in upstate New York, I showed residents copies of the documents we'd uncovered. As I flipped through projected slides of emails, zoning maps, and secretly recorded conversations, I watched the crowd's expressions shift from confusion to outrage. By the end, they were shouting questions, demanding action, and forming committees. On the spot, one woman hugged me and said, "They took my mother's house, but they won't take mine." That night, our team at Home Guard launched the Eastland Investigation Project TAN open source campaign where volunteers could upload documents, track shell companies, and coordinate legal defenses across neighborhoods. Within a week, over 2,000 people had joined. Lawyers offered their time. Programmers built tools to flag suspicious filings. Journalists embedded in council meetings. This wasn't just a community defense effort anymore. It was an underground resistance. But resistance comes with a cost. Natalie's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but her files were rifled through and her hard drive smashed. My email was hacked again, and I received a video of someone walking past our home at 2 a.m., shining a flashlight on the porch where I usually sat in the evenings. It was meant to rattle us. It didn't. We added 2-factor authentication, encrypted everything, and hired private security for public events. We were no longer playing defense. We were preparing for battle. By month's end, we had gathered enough evidence to file a new federal complaint, this time not just for HOA abuse or real estate fraud, but for a criminal conspiracy under the Patriot Act statutes involving financial manipulation and cross-state racketeering. The Department of Justice agreed to a preliminary review, and a multi-agency task force was formed. This meant the fight was official. But it also meant new targets on our backs. Nonprofit's website was hit with a DDoS attack that took it offline for 3 days. Our legal director received a subpoena from a suspicious private firm claiming defamation, clearly a slap suit designed to drain resources. But with donations growing and volunteers flooding in, we had the resources to counter every move. We weren't just defending homes anymore, we were defending truth. One morning, I received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 60s wearing a worn military jacket introduced himself as John Elwood, a former housing regulator who had investigated similar schemes back in the 1990s, but had been forced into early retirement after whistleblowing on a government contract linked to private developers. "You're dealing with a hydra," he told me. "You cut off one head, two more grow. The only way to beat it is to change the law." He became our advisor, helping us draft the Housing Protection and Oversight Reform Act, a federal proposal, requiring all HOA rule changes to be subject to municipal approval, full financial audits every year, and prohibiting HOAs from issuing fines without due process. We found allies in Congress, lawmakers who had been burned by HOAs themselves or who saw the threat growing in their districts. One representative from Texas told us her own parents had lost their ranch to a fraudulent HOA land grab. "Got my vote," she said, gripping my hand. As the bill gained traction, the attacks escalated. A fake news story circulated claiming I had embezzled funds from the nonprofit. It was completely false, but it took us weeks to clear up. Natalie received a package with a dead bird inside. We reported everything, kept moving forward. Because by now, it wasn't just about Willow Glen or even Eastlander Vive. It was about setting a precedent. One night, while organizing digital archives, I found an old voice message my grandfather had left me years ago, buried in a backup folder I hadn't opened in ages. His voice was slow, warm, steady. "Jules," he said, this land, it's not just timber and soil, it's memory. It's where we stand when the world tries to push us back. Don't let them take it." I listened to it 3 times in a row, tears stinging my eyes. That was the moment I knew I would keep fighting, no matter how long it took. Because this wasn't just about property. It was about people, about dignity, about holding the line when no one else would. It's a trial against the new executives. Of Eastlander Vive was still months away, but we were building a wall of evidence they couldn't climb. Community by community, we were restoring power to the people, and if they tried to rise again, we'd be ready. Because when they blocked the ambulance that day, when they tried to erase our legacy, they woke up something they couldn't silence. Me. All of us. The deeper the investigation went, the more surreal it became. It's like peeling back a layer of paint only to find rot buried beneath centuries of bad decisions. And as I met with federal agents, real estate auditors, civil rights lawyers, and reporters, in the living room where my grandfather once played jazz records and read the newspaper by sunlight, I felt like I was watching history crash into itself. The battle for our 150-year-old home is turning into a war against an invisible empire that stretched far beyond Willow Glen and into neighborhoods across the country that had been quietly gutted. In the name of modernization, the FBI agent assigned to the case, Special Agent Ramirez, was a soft-spoken woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a calm presence that masked just how much she already knew. She showed me a map dotted with pins blue for confirmed HOA-targeted homes, red for pending acquisition offers, yellow for disputed evictions, and the entire western side of our state looked like it had measles. "We believe Karen Dodd was part of a regional asset acquisition funnel," she explained. "A test pilot for how to coerce community turnover without using direct force. Your case just gave us the smoking gun." I asked her how many people were involved. She said the task force had identified 37 active players in the scheme: real estate attorneys, shell company brokers, former HOA board members, even a handful of municipal clerks who'd signed off on zoning exceptions or failed to investigate complaints. "They thought no one would notice," she said. "But your grandfather did, and now so do we." As federal subpoenas began flying and grand jury testimonies were scheduled, I focused on helping rebuild Willow Glen. We turned the old HOA office into a community center, replaced the surveillance signs with banners that read "Neighbors, not enforcers." Volunteers painted fences, patched roofs, and offered free handyman services to those who couldn't afford repairs. What once felt like a neighborhood ruled by fear now felt like a village healing itself. We even held a memorial for my grandfather. More than 100 people came, many of them teary-eyed, clutching stories about how he had quietly fixed their screen doors, taught their kids about woodworking, or simply smiled at them on his morning walks. I stood on that porch and thanked them, my voice trembling, and promised I'd honor his fight by finishing what he started. But healing wasn't enough. We had to protect others. Natalie and I launched a nonprofit called HOMEGUARD, a watchdog group for HOA abuse, designed to help communities recognize signs of forced displacement and defend themselves legally before it was too late. Donations poured in. So did horror stories. One came from a woman in Nebraska whose HOA fined her $7,000 over a tree swing. Another from a retired couple in Oregon who lost their home when the HOA sued them for parking a trailer in their driveway during a renovation. They all shared the same DNA. Minor violations escalated into financial warfare, followed by lowball purchase offers. We worked day and night, building databases, filing class action suits, recruiting pro bono attorneys, and creating a legal toolkit any homeowner could download and use. Meanwhile, Karen Dodd's trial date approached. Her defense attorney tried to paint her as misguided but well-intentioned, citing stress, overwork, and a passion for preserving community standards. But the evidence was overwhelming. Meals, recorded phone calls, bank transfers, and the damning footage of her meeting with Mountain Crest Holdings reps. She was offered a plea deal but refused, claiming she'd be vindicated in court. That confidence evaporated 2 weeks into trial, when one of her former board allies turned state's witness and testified that Karen had personally approved the fake fines to lower property values before acquisition. The jury deliberated less than a day. Guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison, ordered to pay $1.6 million in restitution, and permanently barred from participating in any homeowners association or property management business for life. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause when the verdict was read, not because people were happy she was going to prison, but because it finally felt like justice had spoken in a language she couldn't manipulate. I walked out of the courthouse that day feeling lighter. But I knew the system she represented wasn't gone, only exposed. It's the real estate firm that backed her, Mountain Crest Holdings, tried to distance itself from the scandal, rebranding under a new name and scrubbing its website. But the Department of Justice wasn't fooled. Indictments began stacking up. Several of its executives were arrested, and a federal RICO case was filed that would take years to fully unravel. Still, their reach was global. Properties had been funneled into holding companies based in the Cayman Islands, trusts managed by fake charities and commercial banks, with ownership obscured behind corporate veils. The goal was never just property, it was wealth transfer, one family at a time. That's when we realized we needed to go international. Natalie reached out to journalists in Europe, where similar HOA-like bodies called communes or residence councils were experiencing their own scandals. Together, we launched the Global Housing Transparency Initiative coalition of journalists, lawyers, whistleblowers, and activists from 15 countries, all sharing data and strategies to confront housing corruption. We weren't just telling stories now. We were building a movement. Not everyone was on board. I received death threats weekly. One night, someone left a gas canister beside our porch with the words "Stop or Burn" spray-painted in red. Another time, I was followed from a meeting to my home by a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates. The sheriff's office increased patrols around our street, and I installed security cameras, motion sensors, and floodlights on every corner of the property. My grandfather's old gun safe was unlocked for the first time in 20 years. I wasn't scared. I was ready. Because what we were fighting for wasn't just houses. It was legacy, dignity, the right to grow old on the same porch where you watched your kids grow up, to leave behind memories, not eviction notices. I kept a photo of my grandfather on my desk, him holding a coffee cup, staring out over the field at sunrise, and every time I thought about giving up, I'd look at it and remember why we started. The nonprofit grew. We held town halls in 10 cities, hosted online workshops, and lobbied for legislation that would create a federal HOA accountability registry. A bill passed in our state requiring all HOA boards to undergo annual audits and ethics training. 2 other states followed. And in a small town in Kentucky, residents used our legal toolkit to successfully dissolve their abusive HOA, sending us a handwritten thank you card with a group photo of neighbors standing beside their homes, smiling, like they'd won a war, because they had. I still lived in that same farmhouse, now fully restored with help from volunteers and a few grants aimed at preserving historic properties. The porch swing didn't creak anymore. The barn was painted, fresh red, just like my grandfather always wanted. And every Sunday, I sat on the steps, watching kids ride their bikes down the street free, laughing, unburdened by the invisible rules that once ruled our lives. But even in the calm, I knew the fight wasn't over. Morning I received a letter from an anonymous sender in New York. No signature. It's just a printed message that read, "They're rebuilding in the East." Same method, different name. And beneath it, a website, eastlandrevive.org. I opened it and my blood ran cold. A familiar design. It's a fake community revitalization message. And the same shell company trail. Mountain Crest was back. Different face, same teeth. I closed. My laptop looked out at the quiet street and whispered to myself, "Round 2. The morning after I listened to my grandfather's voice message, stepped outside and stood at the edge of our property, staring at the rows of oak trees he had planted with his own hands more than half a century ago, and I thought about how many other families had lost their roots ripped out of their homes, out of their history, all because some corporate shell wanted to flip a neighborhood for a profit. And I knew with full certainty that I wasn't just defending my home anymore. Was standing up for every invisible victim of this silent war. The DOJ task force had begun quietly issuing subpoenas to local government offices that had previously rubber-stamped Eastland Revive zoning approvals, and some of the responses coming in were troubling. In several towns, council meeting minutes had been edited after the fact. Dates didn't line up. One permit approval in Long Point was signed by a councilman who had died 3 months prior. It wasn't just HOA boards that were compromised. It was creeping into public institutions. Meanwhile, our nonprofit Home Guard expanded faster than we anticipated. We now had regional chapters in 12 states, each one made up of local residents, who were either victims of HOA manipulation or allies determined to expose it. We launched a digital dashboard where users could report suspicious activity in real time, sudden HOA rule changes, mass violations targeting a single family, anonymous, buyout offers after penalties. The data poured in. One story from Florida nearly broke. Mia, disabled veteran, was fined $10,000 for having a wheelchair-accessible ramp that violated aesthetic uniformity. Then, after losing an appeal he couldn't afford to fight, he received a cash offer to buy his home as is. No repairs needed. We helped him get legal counsel. And 3 weeks later, the local HOA president who issued the fine resigned under pressure and was later charged with abuse of authority. We were winning battles, but the war was shifting. Eastland Revive wasn't just changing names anymore. It was changing tactics. Instead of forming new HOAs, they began embedding operatives inside existing neighborhood groups, quietly influencing board decisions from within, posing as concerned residents, only to push for rule expansions that favored their long-term goals. A woman from Illinois named Rena called us in a panic. She had been elected to her neighborhood board just 6 months earlier and now realized she was the only member not connected to a holding company that had purchased 3 homes in her development. When she tried to raise questions, they accused her of misconduct and tried to force her resignation. We helped her expose the operation, and the local paper published the full story. But she and her family were later doxxed, their mailbox destroyed, and their home spray-painted with rat. Still, she didn't back down, and neither did we. Natalie and I began traveling across the country, holding workshops and town halls, in churches, libraries, school gymnasiums, and where people would listen. The message was simple. Your neighborhood is yours, not theirs. We taught people how to read bylaws, how to organize legal challenges, and how to use public records to trace ownership behind shadow companies. We were no longer reacting. We were educating, and that terrified them. In several cities, Anonymous flyers began circulating claiming we were radical activists trying to destroy traditional family neighborhoods. One fake article accused me of secretly working with foreign governments to crash the real estate market. The smears were laughable, but they revealed desperation, because for the first time, their targets weren't running, they were fighting back. Congress scheduled its first federal hearing on HOA abuse and real estate fraud, and I was invited to testify. Sitting in that grand chamber, flanked by lawyers and housing rights advocates, I spoke plainly about what had happened to Willow Glen, about my grandfather, about the ambulance that was blocked by a chain and a clipboard, and a woman who thought she was a queen. The room was silent when I finished. Then came the questions. Some senators were skeptical, worried about government overreach into private neighborhoods. Others were angry, demanding answers from regulatory bodies that had failed to act sooner. But the moment that changed everything was when Senator Dupree from Georgia leaned into the microphone and said, "Let the record show this isn't just a local issue. This is a national disgrace." The hearing went viral. Clips of my testimony were shared millions of times. News outlets began profiling victims from coast to coast. By the end of the month, 3 more bills had been introduced to regulate HOA. Power and close loopholes that allowed private entities to weaponize code enforcement. And then came the whistleblower. A man named Kevin, who had worked as a compliance officer for Eastland Revive for 7 years, came forward with documents, internal memos, and emails proving the company had actively targeted elderly homeowners, minority neighborhoods, and areas with weak legal defenses. One email thread read, "Find the cracks. Exploit the silence. Profit off the exit." Kevin's testimony was damning. It confirmed everything we had suspected and more. He revealed that Eastland Revive had tested its tactics in over 50 neighborhoods nationwide using local firms to create the illusion of independence while feeding data back to a central control group. He gave us names, addresses, meeting records, and he told us about something far more disturbing, Project Dovetail. It was a strategic plan to convert entire neighborhoods into rental-only zones, displacing owners, eliminating community voting power, and turning what were once American homes into permanent revenue machines for offshore investors. They don't want neighbors, Kevin told us. They want tenants. Quiet, replaceable, invisible. With this new evidence, the DOJ expanded its investigation. Federal task force raided for Eastland Revive offices across the country. Arrests were made. Bank accounts frozen. A National Housing Oversight Board was proposed with bipartisan support. HomeGuard, once a grassroots website started on my laptop, was now sitting at the table with legislators, attorneys general, and federal agencies. But even as we pushed forward, I couldn't ignore the sense that something darker still lingered in the shadows. One night, while reviewing security footage from our property, I noticed a man standing by the fence for 10 minutes unmoving, watching the house. When the floodlight kicked on, he didn't flinch, just turned and walked away. The next day, I found a note taped to the barn door. It said, "You burned down our forest. We'll return with wildfire." I showed it to the sheriff, who increased patrols again, but I knew this wasn't just a scare tactic. It was a sign that the empire we had cracked open was still alive, still angry, and still plotting its comeback. Natalie suggested we hire a full-time security firm. I agreed. But I also knew that vigilance couldn't be outsourced. We had to stay alert. Because this fight wasn't ending in one town or one court case. This was systemic, institutional. And as long as someone out there saw families as dollar signs, the battle would continue. That night, I sat on the porch, staring at the stars above the field where I used to play as a boy, and I remembered the stories my grandfather told me about how his father defended this land from claim. Oh, jumpers. In the 1920s, they wore badges. 2, he used to say. Didn't make them right. The tools had changed, the language was different, but the threat was the same. And now, just like then, it was up to the people to push back, to stand firm, and to remind the world that homes are not just property, they're the beating heart of freedom. I didn't sleep much that night, haunted not just by the threat taped to my barn door, but by the reality that we had cracked open something far larger than I'd ever imagined when I first saw that ambulance blocked at the edge of our property. And as I sat at my kitchen table before sunrise, flipping through pages of scanned documents and news articles printed out by volunteers from across the country, I realized we had reached a crossroads not just in our investigation, but in how America defines home, community, and power. The national hearings on HOA abuse continued gaining traction, with stories pouring in from every state, families ruined by overregulation, properties lost to predatory fines, elders bullied from their homes by people who wielded community charters like weapons, and what struck me most was how eerily similar they all were. Whether it was Florida or Oregon, California or Maine, the pattern was always the same. An HOA suddenly grew more aggressive. New rules were implemented without due process, and within months, residents were either forced out or offered suspicious buyouts. And behind it all was a maze of LLCs, silent investors, and real estate vultures operating behind polished websites and promises of neighborhood renewal. But the movement had grown larger than I ever imagined. HomeGuard chapters had now been established in over 35 states. We had attorneys, tech analysts, drone surveillance teams, and ex-law enforcement volunteers gathering real-time evidence of HOA corruption. We were no longer just exposing schemes, we were dismantling them. The Housing Protection and Oversight Reform Act, which began as a proposal scribbled on my grandfather's old blueprints, had passed through the House with overwhelming bipartisan support and was now awaiting a Senate vote. If signed into law, it would transform how HOAs function in this country, mandating transparency, limiting financial penalties, banning anonymous ownership in community associations, and granting homeowners federal rights previously denied to them in civil courts. And yet, even with all this progress, the pushback remained relentless. In one city, Approach, OA lobby group calling itself Communities, first attempted to discredit our organization by publishing a falsified financial audit. In another, a small group of online trolls doxed and harassed one of our volunteers, so severely she had to move. But these tactics only made us stronger. Each attack only proved how desperately these forces wanted to remain hidden. I started receiving letters from families we'd helped, handwritten notes, holiday cards, framed photos of homes that had been saved because someone stood up. One letter from a retired school teacher in Tennessee read, "I lived in fear for 5 years, then I read your story, and now I have my life back. I kept every single one." They reminded me that this was never just about us. It was about standing for people who'd been silenced, for those too overwhelmed or too afraid to fight back alone. Natalie was nominated for a National Journalism Award for her work. The documentary she'd filmed about our story was picked up by a major streaming platform. And when it aired, I was flooded with messages from people I'd never met, viewers moved to tears, ready to take action in their own communities. Even celebrities and influencers began sharing the story, not for clout, but because they, too, had stories of HOAs gone wrong, gated communities that turned into open-air prisons. By now, Karen Dodd's trial had concluded, and though she'd been sentenced earlier, a secondary investigation exposed new levels of her involvement. From prison, she had been communicating with outside operatives using coded messages passed through legal correspondence. She wasn't just complicit, she had been coordinating the spread of Eastland Revive. Modeled 2 other HOA presidents willing to join her cause. Additional charges were filed. Her reputation, already shattered, became a cautionary tale. And yet, the machine still pressed on. Even with federal indictments and national attention, Eastland Revive rebranded again, this time as Hearthstone Renewal Solutions, and tried to launch in the Midwest. But we were ready. Our tracking software caught the pattern within a week. We published an exposé, contacted local lawmakers, and sent out alerts to every neighborhood in their target zone. Their operation was dead before it even started. We weren't just playing defense anymore, we were setting the rules. My own life had changed in ways I never expected. I used to be someone who kept to myself, someone who just wanted peace on the family land passed down through 6 generations. But when Karen blocked that ambulance, when she dared to put my grandfather's life beneath her thirst for power, she lit a fire in me that never went out. And now, standing at the edge of our freshly restored porch, the wind brushing through the old oaks, and the sky painted with late evening orange. I looked across the land and smiled, not because the fight was over, but because we had turned grief into action, fear into courage, and a small farmhouse in Willow Glen into the beating heart of a national movement. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe another rebrand, maybe another front. But I did know this. We were no longer isolated. We were no longer afraid. And we were never ever going to be caught off guard again. My grandfather once told me, "Don't let the world tell you when to fight. You'll know." And he was right, because the world did tell me. Told me with sirens, with chains, with a woman's clipboard, and a smirk as she blocked help from reaching my dying family. But I fought back. Now we all do. So if you're hearing this, if you've felt the weight of invisible rules bearing down on you, if your community has been turned into a battleground you never asked for, don't wait. Don't stay silent. Join us. Speak out. Fight back. Subscribe to Sham Stories now and help spread the truth, because every voice matters, and together we are unstoppable. The revelation that Willow Glen had been a trial zone for a much larger scheme ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt since the night we lost my grandfather, a sense of duty, not just to my family or my street, but to every family out there who might be next, blindsided by the same machinery of corruption masked as neighborhood oversight. And as I stared at that grainy footage again on my laptop in the quiet of our living room, I realized this wasn't just a real estate. Scam It was a blueprint for organized displacement, and I wasn't going to let them scale it unchecked. The investigator at the sheriff's office had passed the video to the district attorney's office, and within a week, Karen Dodd's charges were amended to include conspiracy to commit racketeering under state RICO statutes. But as the legal side ramped up, I focused on the bigger picture. I contacted a local investigative journalist, Natalie Price, who had been covering HOA abuse cases for years. She'd written a 3-part series about a community in Fairmont, where dozens of families lost their homes after a similar spike in violations and mysterious buyout offers. I sent her what I had: the USB, the photos, the HOA meeting records, even my grandfather's ledger. 2 days later, she was in my kitchen, drinking black coffee and asking pointed questions about everything from how many homes had changed hands in Willow Glen to how Mountain Crest Holdings handled post-sale construction. They painted as revitalization, she said, scrolling through satellite photos. But really, it's just a hostile takeover wrapped in new siding. Together, we mapped out the timeline. Karen Dodd's rise to HOA president coincided with the arrival of Mountain Crest interest in the area. As fines escalated, so did unsolicited offers. The homes that sold were quickly renovated and relisted at double or triple their original prices often. 2 out-of-state buyers looking for charm with modern upgrades. But it wasn't just Willow Glen. Natalie traced similar activity to Ridgeview Circle, Elm Valley Estates, and a dozen more communities, all with aggressive HOAs. Sudden rule changes, and a connection to one of 5 real estate firms operating under different names, but tracing back to a single parent company registered in Delaware. "This is a nationwide strategy," she said, her eyes narrowing. "They're laundering gentrification through neighborhood law." Meanwhile, back in Willow Glen, things were changing fast. With the HOA dissolved, residents began removing the hideous uniform mailboxes Karen had forced on everyone and restoring personal touches: flower boxes, porch swings, hand-painted numbers. It felt like color had returned to a street that had been washed in gray. But not everyone was celebrating. I received a letter one morning, unsigned, with the words, "You think you won. You're just in the way now. No return address. Number. Fingerprint." But it came the same day that a drone flew over our property and hovered near the kitchen window for nearly 5 minutes. Marcus, a retired air traffic controller who lived 2 doors down, helped me trace the drone signal to a storage facility 5 miles out of town. We reported it to the sheriff's office, who obtained a warrant and searched the unit.
A what?
They found floored me dossiers on dozens of residents. Drone footage, property value analyses, even scripts for HOA violation notices. It was a command center, And whoever was behind it wasn't just tracking Willow Glen. They were monitoring several neighborhoods simultaneously. The DA's office now had enough to convene a grand jury. But the deeper we dug, the more dangerous it felt. Natalie received a threatening phone call from an untraceable number, just a voice saying, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." I found my car tires slashed one morning and a brick with the word revoked in black marker left on the driver's seat. Still, we pushed on. At Natalie's urging, I began compiling a public archive scans of documents, redacted interviews, time-stamped photos uploaded to a secure website with mirrored backups. If anything happened to us, the truth would still be there. The goal wasn't just exposure, it was pattern recognition. We encouraged residents from other communities to send in their stories, and within a week we had over 200 submissions. Some were heartbreaking single mothers losing homes over $80 trash can violations, veterans evicted over improper landscaping, elderly couples fined into foreclosure. It wasn't random, it was industrialized displacement. And it all pointed back to the same network of shell companies and corrupted HOAs, acting as enforcement arms. One night I received a call from Dorothy, my grandfather's longtime friend and neighbor. She was trembling. "They offered me money," she said. "A man in a suit came to my door, said I could leave all this behind for double what my house is worth." I told him no, said I'd regret it. I told her to stay with us for the night, and I installed cameras on her property the next day. That week, someone broke into her shed and painted "You're next" on the inside wall. The sheriff's office placed a cruiser outside her house 24/7. The pressure was rising, but so was public awareness. Natalie's article dropped the following Sunday, titled, "When Home Becomes Hostage: How HOAs Are Being Used to Displace the Middle Class." It went viral. Local news picked it up, then national outlets. Suddenly I was getting calls from CNN, The Washington Post, even a producer from a documentary series on systemic housing abuse. And with the spotlight came leverage. Lawmakers began calling for hearings. State representatives demanded audits of HOAs across the state, and a bill was introduced to place HOAs under the same oversight as city councils with open meetings, term limits, and full financial transparency. Dodd, now released on bond, was placed under house arrest while awaiting trial. But she wasn't done scheming. From her home, she began sending mass emails claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign and that she had been set up by jealous neighbors. She launched a website, realwillowglen.com, where she painted herself as a misunderstood reformer. But the court of public opinion had already passed its verdict. I began receiving thank you letters. People I didn't know from other states writing to say they felt seen for the first time. One family from Arizona sent a photo of their house with the caption, "Saved it because of you." It was surreal. I was just a grandson trying to protect my family's legacy, and now I was part of something national. But with attention came risk. My email was hacked. My social accounts flooded with spam and threats. One message said, "You think the HOA was bad? Wait until you see who you're really messing with." Shared everything with the sheriff's task force, which now included FBI cybercrime specialists. "This goes way past real estate," one agent told me. "This is organized racketeering, property laundering, maybe even foreign capital involvement." They weren't just buying homes. They were rerouting ownership through international trusts, avoiding taxes, laundering money, and using HOA violations to create acquisition opportunities. It wasn't just unethical. It was global crime. Realized then that taking down one HOA wasn't enough. They had to dismantle the system that allowed this kind of abuse to go unchecked. I didn't ask for any of this, but I knew I couldn't walk away now.